Hey guys, welcome to the lecture for this week as we start to discuss what we like to call the Enlightenment. This is the 1700s in Europe, and it wasn't just in Europe, but anywhere that was affected by Europe, that is, places that were taken over by Europe or European colonies. The Enlightenment ideas spread around the globe. Sometimes this time period is called the Age of Reason, and it follows right on the heels of the scientific revolution. So we like to focus on the scientific revolution during the 1600s and during the 1700s, the Enlightenment. And to a certain extent, the Enlightenment is the ideas of the scientific revolution just being placed and put in to a political arena. So using reason and logic and the principles of science and then applying it to society, trying to fix the ills of society or the problems of society with scientific understanding. And so this is the Enlightenment era, Europe in the 18th century or 1700s. And how does this age of reason impact our modern world? We're always trying to take the ideas of the past and make sure that we can see how they apply to our world today. I think that every time we start notes, it's valuable for us to try to put some context to what we're talking about in this class. Remember that this class starts in the year 1450. And we've talked extensively in these lectures about why 1450. It was the end of the 100 Years' War. It was the decade when the printing press was invented, and so there was a communication revolution. This is also the same decade when Constantinople, the old capital of Eastern Rome, fell down, sometimes called the Byzantine Empire. That shifts the balance of power to a different part of Europe than it was before. So 1450 is right in the midst of the Renaissance. And I'm going to say this again for emphasis sake. And if you don't understand this, if it's not ingrained in your brain at this point in class, you need to write this again in your notes. If it's already ingrained in your brain, this is a nice refresher. That's great. But the 1400s, we label that as the Renaissance. Now, there's a lot of other stuff going on, like exploration is beginning, and there are new monarchies that are developing and centralizing their power in Europe. But when we think of the 1400s, think Renaissance, at least the Italian Renaissance, because during the 1500s, the Renaissance is going to spread into the north. But when I say 1500s, I want you to think one word, and that is Reformation. Now, also, there is exploration going on. And as has been discussed before, there are these new monarchies that are centralizing power again. But there is this dynamic shift and split in the religious atmosphere of Europe, where Christianity splits and diverges. We start to get the idea of pluralism. That is, there could be more than one type of Christian. So when we look at the 1500s, we're thinking Reformation. When we get to the 1600s, obviously, this is the tail end of the Northern Renaissance. There's still Reformation ideas going on. There's the English Civil War. But when we think of the 1600s, I'd like you to label it the Scientific Revolution. When we get into the 1700s, there's colonies being set up in the New World. There's going to be the American Revolution and the French Revolution, okay? There's going to be the beginning of even what we might call the Industrial Revolution by the very end of the 1700s. But when we talk about the 1700s, I want your brain to scream the Enlightenment. Now, the 1800s is what we like to refer to as the Industrial Revolution, although it probably started, in the later 1700s, at least in England it did. This is, Napoleon was around in the early 1800s when he's crowned emperor. We haven't really talked about Napoleon yet, but we will in a few weeks. And there's, of course, this new imperialism where the scramble for Africa and the rest of the globe is the maps are finished and the Europeans are taking over almost the entire planet Earth. But when we think the 1800s, I want your brain to scream the Industrial Revolution. When we get into the 1900s, there's all kinds of things like the Great Depression. But there's also World War I before the Great Depression and World War II after the Great Depression. And there's the Cold War, which is like World War III that didn't quite happen, but almost did. And that, of course, would be during the 1900s or 20th century. So when you see the 1900s, I want your brain to scream the World Wars. When we get into the 2000s, it's the globalization era, the era that you live in. We don't necessarily have a label per se for this 100-year chunk of time, because as I'm recording this, it's only 2020. But it's really this time period of globalization where the world is becoming absolutely interdependent and connected. So again, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution, World Wars, and globalization. And that's just a nice way to tightly pack your brain in so that if we learn new information, you have a place to put that information. When we start talking about the Enlightenment, I want you to think about the American Revolution. It's not the only part of the Enlightenment. It's just a small piece of it, but it embodies the ideas of the Enlightenment. So the United States was born during the Enlightenment, and so a lot of the values that we treasure and we just take as fact in our life as Americans, a lot of our founding principles were built on Enlightenment ideas. And so as you think about the Enlightenment, think about the American Revolution, or at least the founding principles upon which our country was founded, and then you'll be rooted in the ideas. So as I talk today, I think you'll see a lot of the ideas from the Enlightenment being woven into some of our early documents, like the Declaration of Independence, like the Constitution, like those battle cries, that Thomas Paine wrote about in Common Sense. A lot of these ideals that we believe in as Americans can be found rooted in this Enlightenment movement. So what was the Enlightenment? Well, the principal goals of the Enlightenment were to bring equality to the people, to promote human rights, and to end the abuses of the church and of the state. That is the Enlightenment in one sentence. It's a time period when people were starting to think about equality and think about freedom and having the right to express their ideas. And they wanted to promote human rights. And even though there was slavery happening in different parts of the world during the 1700s and even partway through the 1800s, the ideas of ending slavery and having some equality and having some humanity and human civil rights kind of ideas were starting to be born. And remember that before this class started, back in the 1300s and 1200s, that was a dark time. In fact, some people even call that the medieval times, or even before that, the Dark Ages. So this is definitely a time period where humans were evolving socially and politically. In fact, if the Renaissance is the rebirth of Greek and Roman ideas, that is, before the 1400s, like in the 1300s when the Renaissance started, and before that, people looked back at the ancients and they thought that the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans were even better than they were during the medieval times. And it wasn't until the 1400s, this rebirth of Greek and Roman ideas, where people started to, go back and study the classics and see how great human beings were in the past and all of their achievements, thus the birth of humanism, or the humanities. But by the time we had reached the 1700s, this is the first time where people were really saying, maybe, just maybe, we've surpassed the ancients. Maybe we've actually evolved further, socially and politically. Maybe we've evolved past what the ancient Greeks and Romans had even done. Because up until this point, we are still looking back at the ancients, way before this class started, and saying, man, look at all the achievements and what they've done. So the Enlightenment places faith in human reason. It builds on the idea of humanism during the Renaissance. So it builds on that idea of the humanists, right? So human reasoning and classical values. So we're still looking back to Greek and Roman ideas, the classics, but we're also starting to question everything. And that's really, I guess, the key of the Enlightenment, and maybe something that all of us could learn and still apply from the Enlightenment. Question everything. Think for yourself. Um, Back in medieval times, the church controlled society. And of course, the Reformation allowed people to start to question church teachings to the point where they weren't being controlled by the Pope, right? And of course, now people are going to start to question the government. Why is the king the king? Did God really make him the king? Or is he just the king because he had a bigger army than the other guy? What is it that makes a king a king? And we start to question these things and come up with new political systems. And that's going to be a huge topic that we need to discuss when it comes down to this whole idea of the Enlightenment. The center of the Enlightenment is France. So I'm going to pause for a second and hopefully you write this down, or maybe it's already in your brain. That's great. But if the center of the Renaissance was Italy, and the center of the Reformation was Germany, right? So the center of the Renaissance was Italy, and the center of the Reformation was Germany, then the center of the Enlightenment is France. Now that doesn't, obviously the Renaissance started in Italy and then spread to the rest of Europe. And the Reformation really started in Germany, aka the Holy Roman Empire. But it spread from Germany to the rest of Europe, right? At least Western Europe. Well, the Enlightenment is going to spread from France. France is going to become the cultural and political focus of the world. And it's going to be really the center of the Enlightenment. So I think that's an important thing to make sure you understand. Those are three topics. The Renaissance, centered in Italy, the Reformation, centered in Germany, and this Enlightenment era, centered in France. I don't think there's really per se a center to the scientific revolution. That one kind of was born from different parts of the world. Some of it was coming from Italy, and some of it was coming from the Holy Roman Empire and Poland, and some of it was coming from France and from England. It was definitely a mishmash of areas. And this Enlightenment's going to spread all over Europe, but definitely it's going to be centered in France. And the philosophers, the thinkers of the time, because a lot of them were French, people refer to them by the French word for philosopher, which is the philosophes. So not too much of a different word. You might even think I just misspelled it. But these philosophes are French philosophers. And they really believed in three things. Number one, the government and the lives of individuals could be changed for the better. Think of the word liberty. They believed that government could be done better. And as we get into this Enlightenment era, we have to understand that during the 1600s, when we had the whole scientific revolution going on, was really this whole era of absolute monarchs. And during the 1700s is also a time of absolute monarchs. Now, the one place in Europe, and of course there's always exceptions to the rule, but the one place in Europe that was really diverging from having an absolute monarch was Great Britain. Remember a couple weeks ago when we talked about the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution? You have to keep those things in mind, that England started going on a different path towards constitutional monarchies. But the rest of Europe was really living in this era of absolute monarchs. And so the Enlightenment was questioning things like divine right. Did God really make the king the king? That kind of a question. Number two, the scientific method and reason could solve social problems and promote social pluralism, aka tolerance. And I'm trying to put some keywords in here to try to help you understand some of the key ideas of the Enlightenment. Remember that during the 1600s is what we call this scientific revolution. Even though there were some of the early scientific thinkers in the 1500s, it's that 1600 time period that we kind of put a label on, a stamp on, saying that was the scientific revolution. And so the people of the 1700s were just building on what had come before them, the Renaissance and the Reformation and the scientific revolution. And they're like putting all the pieces of the puzzle together to try to solve the problems of society and to promote some tolerance and liberty. The third thing, of course, is rationalism is used to solve the problems of the world rather than relying on superstition, reason. In fact, sometimes it is called the age of reason. Okay? The Enlightenment is like the age of reason. Instead of believing that there are evil spirits inside of your body that are causing you to be sick, we start to think, hey, there might be something else besides trolls living in your stomach causing you to be sick, and I know that seems silly and almost ridiculous, but if you look and study medieval medicine, it's barbaric. And so we're using the scientific method and trying to understand laws that apply to nature and understanding that it's not like mystical or magical things that are causing the universe to work the way it does. There are laws that govern everything. In fact, there are some people who we talked about last time during the scientific revolution, people like Sir Isaac Newton, but some people might even think he's a part of the Enlightenment, right? Because of when he lived and how much he affected not just science, but also how policies and politics and things happened, okay? So remember, there is a true evolution of governments. And that's kind of what we're focusing on right here when we're trying to change government and how individual people with liberty, tolerance, and reason, right? We're taking scientific ideas and we're applying it to social issues. Remember that there is an evolution of government. So what I mean is during medieval times, during the Dark Ages, it is a system called feudalism, where there was a king at the top of the food chain, and below him were the lords and nobles, right? The nobility. And 95% of the people in the kingdom would have fell in this category that was called the peasantry, right? Peasants or serfs. The thing is that kings during medieval times didn't have absolute authority. They shared power with local landlords, right? They gave lords a fief. That's like a piece of land to govern, right? And then the lords and nobles would swear loyalty, fidelity to the king, and that's how the system worked. So as long as there was protection, then the peasants would work for their local landlord. And if the king ever called on the local landlord, then he would raise an army and go and back the king. However, during the 14 and 1500s, we start to get these new monarchies that are consolidating power and kind of taking it away from the local lords and nobles and consolidating power within one person. And that's where we get to these absolute monarchs. The best example would be, say, Louis XIV, the Sun King, who ruled during the 1600s, during the scientific revolution, but also partway into this, getting into this Enlightenment era. I mean, Louis XIV died in the early 1700s. So you can see this crossover. Louis XIV would have said that he got his right to rule by the Lord, right? By God himself, the divine right of kings, okay? But this is starting to be challenged by Enlightenment thinkers in the 1700s, saying, maybe it's because you have a bigger army and people are scared of you, and that's why you're in control, not because God granted it to you through some miraculous, experience. And so that was a really important thing that's going to be challenged here, to the point of some of the most dramatic revolutions we've ever seen in the world to date. And again, I'm going to repeat this. During the Enlightenment, during the 1700s, we will talk about both the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Okay? Now, in Eastern Europe, as last week, during week 10, we talked about in Eastern Europe, Russia, and we talked about the difference between Prussia and Russia. Frederick the Great is an example of an absolute enlightened monarch, or enlightened absolutism, where he was an absolute monarch, but he also was trying to bring about some social reform and change the old system, kind of leave the Middle Ages in the past and move forward to a new system. Um, there was also a significant Russian leader, Peter the Great, who started to invoke some major reforms and kind of move the focus of Russia more towards the West, westernizing Russia, and also modernizing Russia. And later, Catherine the Great, of course, built upon that. So many of the philosophes, or these French philosophers, and others, would support a strong monarchy as the best tool to implement the goals and ideas of the Enlightenment. So that kind of seems like a contradiction, eh? But it kind of worked in some regards. There had to be a strong leader to bring about change. Otherwise, you get mass confusion and you get mass death. And that's what's going to happen in the French Revolution. There's not going to be a strong leader. There's going to be just like thousands, tens of thousands of people who get their heads chopped off, blood running through the streets. And it's going to take a strong leader to step in. And so maybe that's proof that it does take a strong leader to implement change. But in Eastern Europe especially, there was a lot what we called enlightened absolutists or enlightened despots, which seems like a contradiction, and it kind of is. But they did bring about some social change. Frederick the Great of Prussia is known as one of the great enlightened absolute monarchs of this time period. Okay, he was a military genius and really put Prussia on the map. And when I say Prussia, I mean Germany. I mean, Prussia was born out of a dying Holy Roman Empire, which is still around, and Prussia's a part of it, but it's going to become its own thing very soon. Okay, let's talk about the Enlightenment and revolutions. Remember that the word revolution means a radical change, right? Sometimes it means war. Remember, during the 1600s, we put the label scientific revolution. We don't mean a war, we just mean a major change, a rapid change, a huge change in how we look at the world and the physical things that we experience. Weather is not controlled by the gods, it's controlled by pressure and temperature, precipitation, right? And so after the 1700s, we're going to talk about something called the Industrial Revolution. Again, we're not talking about a war. We're talking about rapid change in technology and machines and stuff like that during the 1800s. So when we say revolution, what we mean is change. And sometimes that does come in the form of a war. Now, I've said this several times already, but I need this burned into your brain as an AP student. There are several revolutions were born from the ideas of this time period. The first one is the American Revolution, starting in, 1775 all the way to 1783. We usually say that the birth of our country is on July 4th, 1776, but please understand there was actual fighting already happening. That's why we signed the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, because shots had already been fired. Conflict was already upon us, okay? And a couple, decades later, 1789 to 1799 is the French Revolution. And I don't force a lot of dates, but you've got to know when our country was born, July 4th, 1776. And you've got to know when the French Revolution started, July 14th, 1789. We'll talk about Bastille Day and what happened in the French Revolution in another lecture, but I want you to understand that those revolutions were born out of the ideas of the Enlightenment. So, some of the famous philosophers, or thinkers, or writers of the Enlightenment, probably the most famous is Voltaire. Okay? When people think about famous philosophers or French philosophers during the Enlightenment, they think of Voltaire. He was, schooled in a Catholic school and grew up hating how he was treated. He was living in France and saw hypocrisy in the church system and in the government system. And so he rebelled against it. And the way he could rebel is to write. And he wrote until he got himself into trouble. and he was actually kicked out of France. He spent time in prison. He was kicked out of France or exiled. He went up to England and wrote, and he actually thought England was much more chill when it came to, like, say, religious tolerance. So he kind of bagged on France and its lack of religious tolerance, and kind of glorified England and its religious tolerance. Now, England had its own troubles. Remember Bloody Mary, and all of the English Civil War was very steeped in religious conflict. But by the time of Voltaire, England was definitely stable, way more stable than it had been before, and moving forward in that tolerance scale. He believed that people should have civil liberties and religious tolerance. And he challenged traditional religious ideas. He called it deism. And it was kind of like, hey, I believe in God, but I don't think that, like, organized religion is necessarily, actually run by God. Because look at all the corruption and the power struggles that people have in different, religious settings. So deism is not as far as being an atheist. There's, like, no even word atheist at this point. Like, everybody believes in God, or at least culturally they had to, or they could get themselves into trouble with the church. But this is kind of a movement towards atheists, where they still believe in a supreme being that maybe created the universe, but maybe doesn't get involved in the lives of regular people. And that's deism. And a lot of the philosophers were deists. They weren't necessarily straight out atheists, but they were heading in that direction. Another one was Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, again, a French philosopher. He kind of comes up with this idea of a social contract. He's not the only guy to write about it. I mean, there are other English philosophers that also write about the social contract. But Rousseau really puts it in a way that people can really grab onto it. In fact, there are some people in the French Revolution who take Rousseau's ideas to a new extreme. And the social contract is there has to be an agreement between the leaders and the governed, the people who live in the society, where they have to obey certain rules. And a leader can't just go out and do whatever he wants. He has to look out for the interest of the people. And that's what keeps order in society. And he kind of believed, more like direct democracy, right? People should have the power. Okay, they should be involved. And again, some of these ideas are going to get really ramped up into the French Revolution. And we'll talk about the French Revolution extensively, but I'm leading that direction, definitely. There's another famous French philosopher named Montesquieu, the Baron Montesquieu. And of all of these guys, this guy's ideas find its way into American government. I mean, when our forefathers in the United States, people like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton and George Washington and John Adams, they're all getting together, constitutional conventions and other meetings, the Continental Congress, and they're discussing and debating what type of a government to create. They drew on the ideas of Montesquieu. They drew on the ideas of democracy from the Greeks, and the idea of a republic from the Romans, from antiquity. But they also drew on contemporary writers like Montesquieu. Montesquieu, he wrote something called The Spirit of Laws. And in that, his writings, he talked that the power of government, there's three separate powers that government has. The power to make laws, he called the legislative. The power to enforce laws, he called the executive. And the power to review laws or to judge the laws, he called the judicial. And he said that if you separate those powers into different people or groups of people, then they can balance each other out, and then you have more freedom as a group of people. So the whole idea of the three branches that we have in our Constitution, the whole ideas of checks and balances that we thrive on in our world today, was derived from this Enlightenment thinker named Montesquieu. There was also a British philosopher. I wouldn't call him a philosopher because he's definitely British. But Locke actually wrote during the 1688 Glorious Revolution, where he saw a radical change in Britain. And he started to see the formation of the United Kingdom that happened after the Glorious Revolution. And Locke preached the ideas of natural rights. Locke preached the idea of natural rights. And it was something that Thomas Jefferson really bit into. Locke, in his two treatises on government, he said that all men had the right to life, liberty, and property. And Thomas Jefferson took those words and kind of made them maybe a little bit more poetic in the Declaration of Independence when he said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But he didn't try to hide it. He was borrowing on the ideas of Locke, who had been writing, maybe about a century ahead of his lifetime, that there are rights that all of us are born with. And John Locke was definitely an advocate of constitutionalism, and he kind of liked what he saw happening in England and in this United Kingdom that was coming together after the English Civil War in the middle of the 1600s, and of course the 1688 Glorious Revolution. Kant is a German philosopher. He developed an ethical system known as categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is that reason is the source of morality, not religion. In other words, you don't have to believe in God to know that hurting a child is bad. You don't have to believe in a God to believe that slavery is bad. You don't have to believe in God to know that you shouldn't kill or steal. He was saying that logic and reason are things enough. And of course, most of these guys were deists. I drew a little line here because, of course, Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu, those are like the French philosophes, right? The French philosophers. And Locke, of course, is English, and Kant is German. So you can see that it spreads to different parts of Europe. The Enlightenment idea of skepticism was to challenge the accepted truths. So I'm sure you've heard of somebody who's a skeptic. They just don't quite believe it. And then they're wondering why. They're always asking the question why. Positivism, now don't get confused here. Positivism is not like, hey, the glass is half full, not half empty. We're not talking about a positive attitude. A positivism is to positively prove things scientifically, or to verify things mathematically. So we don't believe it unless we can prove it scientifically. We don't believe it unless we can prove it mathematically. So it's almost the opposite of faith, right? There's a lot of people who have faith and believe, even if they can't see. I mean, I guess that's the definition of faith. Now, I'm not saying you can be religious and scientific, but there does seem to be a challenge between those who believe on faith. I believe in something I can't see. I feel it. I know it. And then there's the scientific, rational-brained side of the spectrum. That's positivism. Can you prove it? Can you verify it? And so those are some of the ideas. I think those two key words, I've highlighted them, and I hope you would highlight them in your notes, just to remind your brain that those are the ideas of the Enlightenment. During the Enlightenment, Dennis Diderot, was a guy who wanted to take all of the knowledge that humans had acquired and put it into a book. The problem is there's so much information from apples and aardvarks and amendments and American Indians all the way to zebras and the Zulu warriors of Africa. And there's so many different topics that they put it into alphabetical order. And instead of a book, it turned into like a collection of books that they called the encyclopedia. When I was growing up, that's where everybody got their information from, was an encyclopedia. If you were going to do any kind of research at home, you would have a set of books called an encyclopedia, and it would be alphabetically, organized. There was no such thing as the internet. Now, when the internet started to come about and people started to take things that were in book form and digitalize it, there, of course, was a little joke made, Wikipedia, right? That's supposed to be like a digital virtual encyclopedia. That's why they call it Wikipedia, because it's supposed to be an open source encyclopedia. Everything that we know about in the world put into one place. But this is a pretty revolutionary thing in the 1700s. Enlightenment thinkers attempted to put the sum of all human knowledge in a set of books called the Encyclopedia. And of course, spelled a little differently in French, but you get the idea. So that was a huge undertaking. And a lot of the guys that we just discussed were involved in that encyclopedia, kind of contributing in their area of expertise. But Diderot is the guy who was putting it all together. And as we started to question everything, we started to question like even things like punishment and what's the purpose of punishment, and does punishment really change behavior? Um, and should we be so barbaric in our punishments? I mean, medieval times are pretty horrific. There's a reason people refer to it as the Dark Ages. Even if that term is kind of losing favor with a lot of academics, it really was a dark time. And so this guy, Beccaria, he wrote this book called On Crime and Punishment, which revolutionized views on torture and associated laws in Europe. If you think about the Bill of Rights that we have in the United States, the Eighth Amendment says that the U.S. government cannot have unreasonable bail, and it cannot punish you while you're under custody, is the basic synopsis. And so it's derived straight from these ideas coming out of the Enlightenment. And looking when people were, maybe you've heard of drawn and quartered. People, being tied limbs to horses and being ripped apart. Obviously, hanging is one of the most traditional ways to kill a criminal. But there are some other gruesome things, and quartering a person, chopping them into pieces or cutting off huge chunks of the meat off of a person, right? Huge chunks of skin, or to break a man. And so they're kind of questioning how barbaric this was and how we could do better. Now, how did all these ideas spread? Obviously, the printing press was invented, back by the 1450s. Johann Gutenberg and his movable type, even though they had been using, other kind of things like that in China way before. But, and for the purpose of this European history class, the idea of movable type and the printing press started in the 1450s. So now we're a couple hundred years later, and print is pretty commonplace all across Europe. And so ideas would be spread in pamphlets and, of course, publication of books like the Encyclopedia. But people would get together at gatherings, social gatherings, and discuss what they were hearing, the latest scientific invention or the latest idea that was being written. And women really started to get involved in this process by hosting these parties. And these social gatherings were called salons. Now, when I think of the word salon, I think of like somewhere you go to get your hair done. But honestly, people go to get their hair done, women do at least, go to get their hair done because they can visit and talk. And it's kind of a place where you can talk about what's going on. Nowadays, of course, most of our talk about what's going on is happening on social media in a digital world. But still, this is way before the internet. And so people would literally physically get together, gossip and rumor, but also share news stories and what's the latest story and what's the latest craze and what's the newest fashion. So these were salons. They were gatherings where people would meet to socialize and share ideas about politics, science, and economics. In England, they opened up coffee houses. And I know that you guys think that Starbucks is a new thing, but Starbucks is not just about the coffee. Starbucks is about a place where you can sit down and talk and visit. Some people just meet at Starbucks with their friends and just kick it for an hour. And the fact that they have a coffee in their hand is just a small little piece of it. It's really the discussion and the interaction and the dialogue that happens. And so English coffee houses started to become very important to spreading the ideas in England, just like the salons were happening in France. Taverns are not a very good place to share ideas because people get drunk and then they get pissed off and beat each other up. So coffee is definitely better in that regards. Now, because women often hosted these social gatherings, it helped to empower them. And we really see a shift of the empowerment of women, maybe even the very beginnings of feminism. Women who were trying to prove and show that they could be just as smart as men if they were given equal access to education and opportunities. And probably the mother of this whole idea of female empowerment and femininity and feminism was Mary Wollstonecraft. And every time I teach this lecture, it's getting pretty close to Halloween when I teach it. And I'm always reminded that Mary Wollstonecraft, this woman who was like the mother of this feminist movement, her daughter was Mary Shelley, and she wrote the book Frankenstein. So Mary Wollstonecraft's daughter wrote Frankenstein, the famous monster book. I always think that's interesting. During this time period, classical music is like one of the signs of the beauty of the Enlightenment. When we think about the Renaissance, we think about art, right? Sculptures and paintings and architecture. And there was paintings and sculptures and architecture during the Enlightenment. But when I think about the Enlightenment, I think about the music. Some of the greatest musicians that ever lived come from the Enlightenment time period. And probably, arguably, one of the greatest composers of all time is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. And I don't know what it was, but almost all of these great musicians are German. Of course, there's great English composers and great Russian composers. Of course, I'm not trying to say anything like that. And the French will tell you that they have some of the greatest composers. But arguably, some of the greatest composers of all time, especially during this time, come out of the fragmented pieces of the Holy Roman Empire. Remember, there are two pieces of the Holy Roman Empire that are going to become like their own entities. One of them is Prussia with a P, and the other one is Austria. And so Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart started composing music at the age of 5, and he worked in Salzburg and in Vienna. That's in Austria. And he's famous. Like when you think of classical music, you probably think of Mozart. If we are in class during this week, I always play some Mozart just so people hear it when they're walking into my classroom. Of course, it's a little different with this digital experience, but another one of the great composers of this era was Johann Sebastian Bach, right? If you've heard of famous composers, Mozart and Bach are amongst the greatest. He was a German composer of the Baroque period. So Baroque is a style of music and a style of architecture and a style of art, sculptures. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. I'll show you some examples of Baroque. A lot of enlightened absolutists used it to show off the grandeur and their power. And also the Catholic Church used Baroque to inspire a sense of awe in people. Beethoven, right? Beethoven is the one who started going deaf partway through his career of writing music, but still was able to compose music because he understood even mathematically how the notes fit together. And it was so ingrained in his soul that he could write even when he couldn't hear it. He still knew what it would sound like to an ear. So Ludwig van Beethoven and Johann Sebastian Bach and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. I mean, it doesn't get more famous than these guys when it comes to famous musicians. Oftentimes, all called classical music, but there is some different, like Baroque style, and even towards the end of the 1700s and into the 1800s, we get a new artistic movement called Romanticism. And we'll talk about that, but Beethoven kind of falls under that category. And if there is a third of the famous German Bs, it would be Brahms. So Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, who left their mark. And you can see we're getting into, like, say, the 1800s, which I'm going to refer to as the Industrial Revolution. But you've got to realize that there's always this crossover between these eras, depending on when people were born and when people died, right? Like I was born, in the last quarter of the 1900s. But here I am living deep into the first quarter of the 2000s, right? The 21st century. So which era am I from? It's different. I grew up during the Cold War era, and now I'm living into this globalization era. So it's definitely, we kind of have crossover depending on these people's times. So I embedded some music, and kind of give you a little look. There's definitely others, Handel and Schubert, and Strauss and Tchaikovsky. There's a ton of great, what we might call the masters of classical music. But this is a great example of Baroque art used by absolute monarchs and the Catholic Church. Emotion and lighting and grandeur and balance and detail, right? I mean, there's almost a sense of light and dark in this painting, even though it's just the colors of the paint that's being used. So some really amazing art was done during this Baroque period. Caravaggio is a famous Baroque painter. He does Judith beheading, this guy, and you can tell that there's some serious emotion that's involved in this, and that's one of the key pieces. One of the things we have to talk about is the royal families of Europe, and we need to have you understand the Habsburgs. So if I could just pause for a minute, if I say something like the Tudors or the Stuarts, okay, I'm talking about English history. Okay, if I talk about their Bourbon family, I'm talking about France, right? Valois, Guise, Bourbon, that's the French royal families. If I talk about Russia, I'm talking about the Romanov family. Like, right, they're the ones who dominate politics in Russia. If I talk about even Italy, the Medici family, we talked about them. They weren't necessarily royalty, but they were so stinking rich that all their family members married royalty. Okay, but when we talk about the Holy Roman Empire, and to a certain extent, when we talk about the Spanish Empire, we're going to refer to a family that was probably the most powerful royal family in all of Europe, and that's the Habsburgs. The Habsburg family was one of the most powerful families in all of Europe, and there's two lines right after. If you guys remember Charles V, he was the guy who was running the Diet of Worms when Martin Luther was put on trial. He was the Holy Roman Emperor. Anyways, after him, he kind of split his holdings into two branches. There was the Spanish holdings, and then there was the Austria. Okay, it's going to become it's a part of the Holy Roman Empire. It's going to become its own thing. So there's two lines. The royal families would intermarry with each other. So this is going to sound gross and ew, but oftentimes people would marry their cousins all the time. That way you keep it in the family line, because if you marry outside of the family, then you're opening up other families who will have claim on your territory and on your possessions. And so I know this is kind of gross. I kind of always like to make that joke, if your family tree doesn't fork, you might be a redneck or European royalty, right? So it was not okay to marry across different social levels. So it's better, even if say you're the king of England, you might marry your daughter or son to the king or queen, to a princess or prince in Spain. Even though you guys were rivals, you're still rivals at the same level. So like Henry VIII, his first wife was the daughter of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain. He married their daughter, Catherine of Aragon, right? So you got to marry on your same level, even if you marry your enemy's daughters. And hopefully that brings the kingdoms together, but it also can cause some serious issues. One of those issues during the 1700s was the War of Austrian Succession, and it was started when Prussia invaded Habsburg-controlled lands to challenge Maria Theresa's royal claims. And Maria Theresa was a woman, obviously Maria, and usually the rights of succession were passed on from father to son. But there are some instances where a guy doesn't have any sons, and he doesn't want to, give up the power to another family, and so he passes this on to his daughter. And that was a huge deal, something called the Pragmatic Sanction, where Maria Theresa ruled Austria for 40 years during this Enlightenment time period. And she solidified power by recognizing the importance of Hungary in the Austrian Empire. So actually, Austria starts to call itself Austria-Hungary, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it's going to last all the way to World War I. So it's definitely something you're going to want to be familiar with, the House of Habsburg. This right here, you can see the red is the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs. The yellow is, of course, the Austrian branch of the Habsburg Empire. And Habsburg people, or especially the kings, are known for having some genetic defects because there was so much intermarrying. They have this like exaggerated jawline, and some of them were pretty inept rulers. Because the Habsburgs were so powerful, we have to be reminded of that concept of a balance of power. Again, I put up here at the top the Pragmatic Sanction in the early 1700s was to try to deal with women's right to inherit land and title because they didn't want to give land and title to another family. They wanted to keep it within their own family. So I think this is a great map to show you how dominant the Habsburgs were in European politics, okay, especially during the 15, 16, and 1700s. By the time we start to get into the 1800s, we start to see the end of Habsburg power. And really, at the end of World War I, in the early 1900s, we finally see Austria fall apart and Germany kind of gets carved up and stops being an empire until Hitler comes along. But anyways, it's hard to stress how important the Habsburg family was. I'm just going to brush up on a couple of the philosophers. Again, Voltaire. His most famous work was Candide. We already talked about Voltaire, so I'm going to brush through this. He did write biographies about Louis XIV and Peter the Great of Russia, so you can kind of see what time period he was living in. He would have been around when Louis XIV, that absolute monarch, was around. And he would have been around during the time of Peter the Great, absolute monarchs. He wrote thousands of letters and pamphlets, and like I said before, even spent time in jail for his writings, where he tried to push for religious tolerance. He was actually exiled to England for a while. There was one of Voltaire's ironies that he saw was an event that happened in the middle of the 1700s in Portugal. The capital is Lisbon, and there was an earthquake in 1755. And this is one of his arguments to try to say, how could there be a God? Because during the middle of this earthquake, and of course the tsunamis and the fires and the stuff that happened with an earthquake, there were like hundreds of faithful Christians who ran into a church and were praying for God to save them, and the church collapsed on them. And Voltaire was like, come on, really? Could there be a God? Or if there is a God that made the world, I'm not saying there isn't, he's definitely not hearing people's prayers. And that was one of his justifications for deism. Montesquieu, as I pointed out earlier, who wrote The Spirit of the Laws, of course, he's the guy who talked about the separation of powers, and really is the foundation of the U.S. Constitution. So this French philosopher, okay, who died just before the American Revolution, he's definitely a Frenchman, but he's going to become one of the embodiments of American idealism, right? He's the guy who says we should have a legislative branch that makes the laws. In our country, we call it Congress. He says you should have an executive branch, right? That enforces the laws or executes the laws. And that, of course, in our country is the president. And you should have a judicial branch that reviews the laws and makes sure that they're fair and just. That's the judicial branch. In our country, the Supreme Court, okay? And those separate but equal. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, as we talked about before, wrote The Social Contract, and he believed in direct democracy, right, to ensure people's freedoms, and his ideas were used in the French Revolution. There were also some British thinkers like John Locke, and again, I talked about these guys just kind of reviewing, to be honest, so that they're stuck in your head. Wrote the Two Treatises of Government to defend the glorious revolution of 1688. And he did not like the idea of the divine right of kings. He believed in constitutionalism, right? He advocated for it. And he said that governments were created to protect the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. And of course, Thomas Jefferson is going to snag those ideas when he writes the Declaration of Independence. Now, that's the part where we're going to close, but I want to point out, as I always try to do, that there are a ton of great review videos on all of the philosophes, or it's going to bring up like Hobbes, who wrote during the English Civil War, and Locke, and how they see things differently. We're going to see how the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment go hand in hand. And we're going to see how religion is questioned, deism comes about, or enlightened absolutist, right? And so there's all kinds of ideas in these videos. If you don't understand something from my lecture, there's plenty for you to look at. Thanks for joining me on week 11, The Enlightenment.